Hi students, Jeff Reber here with you again, this time to talk about our chapter 11 topic, liking and loving others. This is, I think, relevant to all of us. Love is a universal experience across time and culture. So it's a good topic. And what I want to talk about today is not so much what's covered in the book, although I'll make connections to the material in the book. I want to introduce you to a philosophy about relationships that I think helps us to understand the book's material on love, but broaden our scope and understanding of love to be more inclusive of some of the things psychology doesn't study as much, mostly because it's not easily studied with empirical methods, but is something we all experience and think is important. So the philosopher Martin Buber he's dead for a long time now, but was a German philosopher who wrote a book called I and Thou. He's actually a German Jewish philosopher, I should say, who wrote a book called I and Thou back in 1925, I think was the first publication date on that. He's a veteran of World War I, experienced, along with many soldiers from that war, the disillusionment of warfare, the falling apart of Europe in terms of the monarchies and the empires that ran it. After World War I, those were all dissolved, of course, and you had countries striving to figure out how to have democracy and other forms of government, and didn't always succeed very well. As you know, Germany, for example, ended up with a fascist dictatorship in the 30s and 40s with Adolf Hitler. So he was in a very interesting and challenging time and wrote his thoughts about love and human relationships, I think, as an important counter or counter argument, I should say, to the disillusion people were feeling, the existential angst they were experiencing, the feeling that life and its purposes had all become either destroyed, dismantled, or had to be changed. He offers this book, I and Thou, in the middle of that, at a time when I think it was really needed. But I think it's also important for us today. So I want to introduce you to the basic philosophy of I and Thou. It's not really a book that I think is easy to read. It's written in a kind of poetic style. If you did want to read it, that would be great, but I think you might benefit more from my lecture, where I'm going to summarize the main points or some commentaries on it. But if it does interest you enough, you can get a copy of the book very cheap. It's fairly thin. It's not a long read, but it is complicated by its style of writing a little bit. I love it. I think poetry is probably the best way to express love and other emotions and relationships, but it can sometimes be a little harder to access than, prose, direct writing. With that said, let me review his philosophy a little bit, and then I'll connect it to some of the material in the book so you can see how it relates to the topics that you read about. So I and Thou is one kind of relationship. Well, the I-thou is one kind of relationship. I-thou. The other is I-it. And Buber's fundamental point is that these are two ways of relating to the world and to each other, and even to God. But you never get out of relationship. You're always in relationship with the world around you, with other people, and with divinity. Those things are inescapable. It's not a question of can you be in or out of relationship. It's a question of how you live into your relationships. Even the hermit who, will try to abandon civilization, run out into the desert, live in a cave, and be isolated, is still in a relationship. A relationship of absence is a kind of relationship. If you think about people who have grown up without a parent because that parent may have died or may have left the home and run away, that child grows up in a relationship of absence that is its own kind of relationship and has its own challenges and qualities that matter. and affect the way the child lives and thinks and behaves. So even absence is a form of relationship. So for Buber, we shouldn't ask questions of, are we in a relationship or not? We always are. It's a question of how. And our relationships go even to people we don't see directly, or to the parts of the world, the environment we don't interact with directly, or to the divine realm, the transcendent realm, God's realm, where we may have no experience of interaction directly with a divine being, but that relationship still exists nevertheless. So let me talk about each of these kinds of relationship or forms of relationship we can be in. And we really alternate between them. We spend most of our time in what Buber describes as the I-it relationship. The dash is important because it shows that the I and the it, which is like an object or a thing, that these are always bound to each other. The dash connotes the bond that you can't escape when you're in that relationship. So there's like a holism where you as the I and the object you're relating to as the it are connected and bound to each other in this kind of holistic experience or relationship. In the I-it relationship, we are relating to the world, to other people, or to God as if those are all objects. They're things to be used, to be experienced, to be studied. So Buber uses the example of a tree, a very simple example. And he says, look, if I am relating to a tree in an I-it way, then that tree for me is going to be an object that I could study. If I am a forestry major, for example, I could study trees. I have a friend who did that for his major, loves trees. I can learn about how it's, how it grows, how it processes oxygen through photosynthesis, how it, the sap moves through it. I can cut it and I can study the rings in the trunk to try to get a sense of its age. I can cut it down and chop it into wood. And from that wood, I can either build a fire or I can build a home. I can build baseball bats, I can use it. In all of this, he says, I'm having an experience of this thing as an object, and I relate to it as an object. And by the way, there's not something inherently wrong with that. In fact, it's very important sometimes that trees serve us as objects for particular needs that we might have. Paper, for example, depends on using trees. But that shouldn't be the only way we relate to trees. And there can be other ways to relate to trees where we don't treat them as objects. And Buber says from time to time it can happen where I might be out in a forest. Here, that could be your backyard in Georgia. And I encounter a tree, and in that moment, I'm not concerned with using it. I'm not concerned with it as an object or experiencing it. Maybe I'm just kind of caught up with its beauty and its majesty and its longevity. The oldest tree, this is kind of a sad story. The oldest tree in the world, I believe, was a tree in Florida that was estimated to be 3,500 years old. This was I don't know what kind of tree, but the tree had outlived, civilizations, been around since the time of ancient Egypt or ancient Chinese civilization. And just within the last, I think it was maybe about 10 years ago, some vandals, they actually destroyed the tree. And sadly, we no longer have this 3,500-year-old specimen of nature to either relate to as an object or to really just stand with and be in awe of its longevity, how long it lasted. Clearly, the vandals were having an I-it relationship with the tree, treated it as an object for their own pleasure, and destroyed it. But sometimes, under the right conditions, and I'll talk about those conditions in a minute, the tree can kind of relate to me in a different way. I can be kind of caught up in its beauty and majesty and my awe with it and just kind of be with the tree. This he describes as an I-thou relationship. Thou is kind of Old English. In German, it would be du. And du is the informal you. So in German, if you want to speak formally to somebody, which you should do if they're older than you or it's your first time meeting them, you would use Z, which is a formal address to say you to somebody. If you're in an informal relationship, like with your own children, your spouse, people you know well, then you use do, which is this more intimate, connected way of describing a person as you. So thou, which is kind of a poor English translation, thou is actually a more intimate form of you than you might think. I know because it's an ancient word in biblical texts a lot, thou. We think of it as formal, but it's actually more intimate and close. So for Buber, when you're in that I, thou, or ich, du relationship, you are actually relating to something in a very connected, intimate, and close way. So that can happen with nature. That can happen with a tree. I don't know about you, but some people will go out into nature desiring to go beyond an I-it connection and try to have this kind of spiritual, transcendent moment of being a part of nature and really loving nature, being connected with nature. A lot of painters have gone out into nature and painted a scene that just captured their soul in a certain kind of way. This is love for Buber. This is really to love nature. Now, there are instrumental I-it forms of love, but the kind of love that happens in I-thou is transcendent love. It's really quite special. And maybe sometimes you've gone out into nature for that purpose, to have that connection, and it's happened for you, and it's been wonderful. But there are other times where you go out and you're trying to have that special kind of moment, and everything just seems to go wrong. You step in a cow patty, or you bump into a hornet's nest, or you trip and cut your leg, or things just don't work well. You lose your water bottle, something, and your trip just goes poorly, and you went out to have a kind of I-thou connection, we might say, a relationship with nature, and it fell apart. For Buber, there's conditions that have to be met to shift from an I-it to an I-thou relationship, to move into that kind of special, transcendent kind of love. And the conditions are two things. First is will. So I have to want it, desire it, will it. I want to have this connection. So if I get my hiking gear on and I go out to go on a hike, and I'm seeking to have a deeper, intimate connection with nature, then I have the will. But the second condition is grace. And for Buber, this is grace that comes from God, or the eternal thou, he would say. And if that grace is given as a gift, then my will and that grace come together, and nature and I get to be in this kind of this special transcendent relationship. But sometimes grace doesn't come. Sometimes I want it and I can't get the connection with nature. Sometimes it comes as a surprise, where I wasn't seeking it and I happen to be kind of caught, or seized is the word Buber uses. I'm seized by the thou, and the relationship happens. So it can come as a surprise, or it can come through intention, but grace has to be bestowed upon the connection for it to shift from an I-it to an I-thou. We can't totally control that. It's not totally up to us. And when it comes to thinking about love, there's some truth to that. My being able to have a loving, intimate connection with my children or with my spouse is not wholly up to me. They participate in it as well, and a certain kind of grace sometimes happens where we're caught up in this intimacy, this love, this transcendence sometimes. When I think about people and our relationship with people, so let's shift away from nature for a moment. When I think about that relationship, I'm mindful of the experiences I've had, both falling in love, like romantically, but also the love I've experienced for my children. So let me start with falling in love. And I can do this very easily because I still remember the first time I saw my wife. I can remember when she was very young. She was 14, I believe, and I was 16. We attended different high schools in cities that were about 10 minutes away from each other. And through a kind of church connection, actually. She became friends with um, a guy in my school, younger than me by a couple of years. She's younger than me by a couple of years. They became friends, eventually became boyfriend and girlfriend. And he was on the volleyball team that I was on. And one day we were practicing volleyball, and for whatever reason, she had come to visit him. I didn't know of her. He was a friend, but I didn't know, I think he might have mentioned he was dating her, but I had not met her. Um, so I'm practicing volleyball and totally focused on that. And the door into the gym opens. And I mean, this is going to sound super cheesy, guys, and I can't help that it does, because it happened exactly as I'm describing it. So cheese is what you're going to get. The door opens and in walks Angela, my wife, then someone I'd never met. And I remember just being drawn to the door opening, maybe because it made a noise, and seeing her walk in. And it was one of these kind of, almost angel singing moments, and I don't know if it's because the sun was bright that day outside, but and she's blonde. And so her hair was kind of like glowing in a way, but it just had this kind of special moment where a volleyball could have hit me in the face and I wouldn't have noticed. I was fully focused on her, probably creepy from her perspective, but for me, it was this truly I thou moment. I didn't experience her as an object or a thing, something I wanted to use or whatever. It wasn't sexualized or anything like that. It was just a connection that I had and with her. I'm not even sure if I were to ask her that she would have said she had that same connection. So even though she participated in it in some way, it wasn't her will or desire to have it. For me, the will came second to the grace. The moment I saw her and felt that connection, I wanted to know her, to get to know her. So long story short, she dated my friend for a while. It was not till 2 years later. So we had some interactions just as friends, and I'd see her at different events and things. But 2 years later, she decided to actually ask me out. And we went to, I think, a Sadie Hawkins dance or something. And by this time, I had graduated from high school. She was a junior, I think. And we started to date. And, this friend of mine, he found out about it, was very upset. It's kind of funny. I was actually dating his sister. And so when we got together, Angie and I, we dumped, she kind of dumped him. I think they'd been broken up already. But anyways, he felt like he was getting dumped by her. I dumped his sister, and they were left, brother and sister. They couldn't date each other. So we had each other, and they were left out in the cold, I'm afraid. But, there's nothing I could do about it in a way. I mean, love sometimes seizes you, as Buber would put it, and pulls you into a relationship. That's part of that grace. And sometimes the will comes later or follows after the grace. Sometimes the will precedes the grace, but you got to have both of them in order for that I thou connection to happen. And I've had many I thou moments with my wife, from way back when we first started dating as teenagers until today. And each of those moments, if I think about it, those are the things that I feel really are the basis of our relationship and our love. And by the way, I should mention that even though this example of her walking into the gym and glowing and me having all the feeling of deep connection, it's a positive example, but I've also come to love my wife more through I thou moments when we have suffered together. So I don't want you to think that love and the I thou relationship only happens for Martin Buber and for me, because I really do believe in this viewpoint as being pretty valuable. It doesn't just happen in positive moments. You can have deep intimacy in suffering. So when my wife's best friend and cousin died from lung cancer early on in our marriage, and she grieved, I was able to hold her and be with her. And we had a lot of I thou connection around her grieving, as we did when my sister passed away from a brain tumor about 20 years ago. And recently my brother-in-law passed away, who was my best friend growing up. We were able to hold each other in an I thou moment of grief and suffering. And those moments are as important to me in what I would say my love, the love my wife and I share. They're as important as the beautiful and enjoyable moments that we have together. So enough of the mushy romance. I thou. I also want you to know that when each of my children were born, that was, in each case, there's four of them. In each case, that was an I thou moment. And what I like about this example is that up until the moment of their birth, everything was very I it. So I'll talk about my first child, my daughter, when she was born, because we had not had the experience of giving birth before and becoming parents. So prior to her birth, you study everything. This child that's in my wife's womb is like an object of study. It's an it, because I haven't met her yet, and I'm not holding her in my belly, so I don't have any opportunity to really relate to her. I felt her kicking and so on, but I really just, did a lot of it work, which is totally appropriate and sometimes important. I studied all the books, what to expect when you're expecting, and, how to go through being a supportive spouse during the birthing process and everything. And I remember when the day came, it was in the morning, and my wife said, I think I'm having contractions. I think it's time. And this was about, it was about a week, I think, before the due date. And so we were ready, we were prepared. And so, but the moment she said that, I went into it mode. My wife then became this object that I had to treat according to all the things I studied and read about in a way that she would have a good experience and the baby would be born in a healthy way. So I started just kind of grabbing my wife and moving her where she needed to go, And she was like, wait a minute, I'm not ready yet to go to the hospital. I'm like, no, we got to go to the hospital. The book says, there's this much time before, and I'm using all of my research and my study, and I'm not relating to her as a thou at all. I'm hardly listening to her because I'm nervous, and I'm anxious to get her to the hospital where I know she can have a baby safely, and, not me trying to deliver the baby in the car or something, which of course I heard those horror stories. So I'm in very it mode. And then when I get her in the car and we're driving to the hospital, everyone I'm driving by is an it. And I'm just thinking of them as objects in the way of me getting where I need to go. So I'm very instrumental is another word for it relationships, meaning I'm treating other people as a means to my end or as in the way of me getting to my goal. And so I'm just instrumentalizing everyone along the way. I'm saying all the things to my wife that I've read and studied I should say, and I'm trying to get her to breathe and manage her contractions. And I get to the hospital, and then the doctors and the nurses take over in an it mode too. They need to treat her as an it right now because they gotta get this body into the bed and get the monitors and everything connected so that they can understand if the baby's heart rate is steady and good, if my wife's heart rate is steady and good, and all of those things. So the doctors and nurses go into it mode. I'm in it mode. I'm not sure my wife appreciates all that, but she's aware that this is appropriate to the context. We're not having a deep, intimate connection right now. We're trying to get her situated so a healthy baby can be born. And we go through the, hours of labor together in that it way. And my mind is racing on all the things I should be doing as a husband, to how do I hold her hand, and how do I instruct her to breathe? And do I remember the breathing, which I still remember today? It's, I still remember all of it. I think I practiced more than she did. And that was 26 years ago. But so, we go through all of that. And then the time comes where she's asked to push, and we get to that point, and she grips my hand so hard that she is definitely treating me as an it, a squeeze toy to get her pain, managed. And so I willingly let her destroy my hand and break all my, no, she didn't really break my bones, but it felt like she might. And then she pushes and pushes, and finally this baby comes out. And, up until the moment that the baby is delivered, I think she and I are in a kind of it mode. And then the baby comes out, and the doctor lays the baby on my wife's chest, and I just start to cry. It's like grace just fills the room. And of course, I want to have a connection to this child because she's ours, and we're going to raise her, and we're going to be responsible for her, and the love just flows so easily. And all three of us shared, maybe the doctors and nurses, I didn't pay too close attention to them, but at least the three of us shared this beautiful I thou, connection and moment. And it was great. But of course, it doesn't last. The thing about I thou is that it tends to be ephemeral. It tends to come and then it goes. So as much as we were enjoying that moment and holding the baby and feeling all the love possible, then the nurses say we need to take the baby and do some testing and make sure that everything's functioning the way it should. So they take the baby and they go back into it mode, and then the doctors, I'll just say, cleaning up my wife, and he's in it mode, and my wife's trying to just sustain the pain of what's just happened, and I'm trying to comfort her. So we all go back into I it. But then, moments later, after that's all passed, we have time with the baby again, we're holding her, and we go back into I thou. And it goes like this, for hours at a time we'll be in I it, and then it's time for the bath, and I get to go with the nurse and learn to bathe the baby, and I get my I thou connection there while my wife's sleeping, and then it comes time for my wife to try to breastfeed. And you would think this would be the most natural kind of I thou moment for a mother and child, but it's actually quite challenging, and my wife is struggling to get the baby to latch on, which is the term they use, to start to really successfully draw milk and feed herself off of my wife. And in that moment, we're realizing this is not I thou, and we've got to get instrumental, and we've got to kind of treat the baby instrumentally and figure out how to get her to latch on. And so we're kind of pressing her head onto the breast, and we're trying to move her mouth with our finger to open and get it on there, and all the things we can do. And then this lactation nurse comes by, hearing we've had some trouble and getting the baby to feed, and she goes into I it mode in a way I've never seen. I mean, she is literally just, she makes my wife's breast into the shape of a torpedo, and she grabs my daughter by the back of the head, and she just shoves them onto each other in this very aggressive manner, and my wife's getting yanked, and the baby's almost ready to cry, and oh my goodness, that was as stressful as anything I've ever experienced. But it was, that nurse was treating both my wife and daughter as it's just two separate things, a source of food and a mouth needing to get on it, and just pressing them together. We quickly got her out of the room. She wasn't very helpful. And then, over time we found our way to get that breastfeeding going successfully. And then my wife was able to feel that connection and release her anxiety and about not being successful in it, and realize she can be a great mom, and all that wonderful I thou happened. So I've still had I thou moments with my daughter. She's 26 years old now, and I have had moments very different than when she was born, of course, where we have shared connection and depth and intimacy, and that's been true with all my children. So that's a couple examples of I thou in both a romantic love form, but also in a parent-child relationship, where that attachment that happens, the book talks about attachment theory and getting a secure attachment with your parents. I believe, as Martin Buber does, that having I thou connections with your children contributes greatly to a healthy attachment style. I think it's really important, in fact. Then, Buber talks about the I it and I thou in relation to God. And I won't spend a lot of time on that. It's not exactly germane to our topic, but I will say that for Martin Buber, there are moments of spirituality where our connection to the heavens, however you understand that, for Buber, God is a person with whom we have relationship. But however you understand it, there are these moments of spiritual connection and a feeling of unity with the divine that many, many different religious traditions talk about. In fact, every religious tradition talks about some kind of sense of unity and connection to something transcendent, divine, beyond this world, that holds a special feeling and a kind of grace that is bestowed upon it that allows it to happen. Although, as you know, it's also possible to relate to God in an I-it way. For many people, God is a big vending machine that dispenses blessings if you are obedient to commandments. That would be an I-it form of relating to God. I need God to bless my life, so I pray, so I get blessings. That's an I-it approach to God. And we're probably going to have those as religious people on occasion, especially when we're suffering and we need help. We're going to seek God as an object of providing blessings to relieve our suffering. And that's acceptable. That's okay. As long as that's not the only way that we relate to God. If we stay in an I-it relationship to nature, other people, or the divine, that's where the problem comes. So for Buber, there has to be, I'm going to use my hand here, an oscillation, kind of a back and forth between I-it and I-thou, so that we're never just in one way of being. Now, I-thou, that's not very hard because I-thou doesn't last. We get interrupted, distracted, and we fall out of that I-thou connection. But I-it, we could get stuck in that if we're not careful. People with severe psychological trauma sometimes, or other disorders, will resist connection with people because their fear of trusting and being hurt is so strong. So they don't allow themselves to oscillate into an I-thou relationship. And this keeps them from having those connections and moments of intimacy that make us human and draw us together with other people. So we have to have that ability to move between I-it and I-thou. And people who can't do that tend to suffer significant psychological challenges. Okay, so that's the theory, essentially, of Martin Buber. The way that I-it and I-thou are similar is they're both forms of relationship with nature, other people, and the divine. They're also similar in that they're both useful and positive at different times in different contexts. If I am a surgeon and I need to operate on a person, I've got to relate to that person as an it, or I'm not going to be able to draw a scalpel through their skin. So there are times where I want to be in an I-it relationship. There are times where it's good to be in an I-it relationship. And there are times where it's good to be in an I-thou relationship and where we want to be in an I-thou relationship. We need them both. They both serve different purposes, but they're both part of being a human being. Remember though, you've got to be able to fluctuate or oscillate, move between them with some flexibility, some fluidity. If you get rigid in I-it, then you do not have access to your full humanity and to the experience of love in its fullness. So if you find yourself having gone a long time without feeling an I-thou connection with nature, other people, or the divine, Buber would say you need to get some of your will generated for this, overcome your fears about being vulnerable and trying to connect with somebody or something in a deeper way, and allow grace in. Because being in I-thou relationships is a natural part of life, even if it's not as often the way we relate as I-it. Now, the book, of course, doesn't deal with the I-thou. It doesn't focus on that. It talks more about love from an I-it perspective. And again, that makes sense because they've been using empirical methods, which are the epitome of an I-it approach to studying and understanding the world. But I do want you to be mindful that there are limitations on that. So particularly, I'm just looking here on page 418 at the reward theory of attraction. And that really does articulate well an I-it approach to attraction. That we are attracted to people because we gain some kind of reward or reinforcement for that. There's some benefit that comes to us. You know, some people are attracted to very physically attractive people because it boosts their self-esteem and they get some kind of praise or value placed on them by others because they've succeeded in attracting a partner who's very physically attractive, or someone who's very wealthy or has fame, prestige. These things can also make us feel better about ourselves. And that's I-it. I'm using you as a partner, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it might be, because it provides me a sense of self-esteem boost or other kind of reward. When you hear that, it of course sounds awful, but if we're being honest, all of us have moments where we use our partner for reward. Sexuality is a good example. Sometimes sex is a I-thou moment where will and grace come together and there's a beautiful connection between you and another person. But there's also times where sex is about self-gratification, and we use our partner as an object to satisfy our sexual desires. And when that, reaches the point of not being consensual in the form of harassment, rape, sexual assault, then that is criminal and a significant problem. But even with consensual sexual behaviors, sometimes we're just in an object-minded approach to sex, and we use the other person for the pleasure that we get from that. And we might say, again, that's not ideal. Doesn't matter. That is going to be part of anyone's sexual relationship with a partner over the course of their lives together. And you hope that you can have some fluidity, some flexibility to move into I-thou moments of sexual connection. But, grace has to be there as well as your will. So if those moments come, you cherish them, you love them, and just let yourself really feel them fully, but they're not going to stay, and they're not always going to be the case. Sometimes I talk about the I-thou being kind of like a butterfly that happens to fly and land on your shoulder. It's this beautiful moment, if you don't have a fear of butterflies, it's this beautiful moment where this beautiful creature has chosen you and landed on you. But if you try to keep the butterfly there, putting your hand over it, cupping over it, or grabbing it, you're going to damage the butterfly and probably kill it. So I-thou has to be allowed to come and go. And you can't control when it comes all together, and you can't make it stay forever. It comes and it goes. And the same is true with having good experiences with a romantic partner. Sexually, it comes and goes. Interpersonally, dialogically, it comes and goes. Sometimes you have beautiful conversations where you understand each other, communicate well, and you feel this I-thou connection. And sometimes you're just arguing to make a point and be right. All of that is part and parcel of being humans. But we got to have the full, complete picture to really have full love and full humanity. So the reward theory of attraction makes sense in an I-it relationship, but it can't be successfully love if it is the only reason you're having that relationship. If you are only with your partner because of the rewards it provides, that is not full love. That's not the complete package, the I-thou. The other theory that I wanted to mention, I think the book talks about, it's related, is equity theory. And equity theory is where you do a kind of calculation in your mind. Some people actually write it out, where you are making sure that your relationship with a partner is equitable. And by equitable, I don't mean equal. I mean this. It means that if I'm putting a lot of contribution into this relationship, then I expect I should be getting some benefits out of it too. If I'm putting very little contribution into the relationship, then I don't expect a lot of benefits. So it's a weighing, a balancing of contributions and benefits between partners. If I see that I'm putting a lot in and getting a lot out, and you're putting a lot in and getting a lot out, then that's equitable. If I'm putting a little in and getting a little out, and you're getting a little out for putting a little in, that's equitable too. As long as we're balancing our contributions and benefits, goes the argument of equity theory, then we're going to have a satisfying relationship. Now, of course, in an I-it realm, yes, that is a good way to balance treating each other as an object of benefits relating to yourself, giving contributions. And if you're in an I-it mode, it would make sense to expect that equity. In an I-thou relationship, that falls away, at least for the moment, right? It's going to come back into an equity relationship probably. But in the moment of the I-thou relationship, you're not keeping track. You're not keeping score. You're not evaluating who's giving more and who's getting more. You are simply in the moment, experiencing a deep intimacy. There's almost a unity, so you don't even really experience yourself as separate in that way that you would in an I-it relationship. So equity has its place when we're in an I-it mode. Another way to talk about this is exchange relationships versus communal relationships. Exchange relationships are marked by keeping count. It's like a contract. I give you this much, you give me that much. There are some marriages where that's actually worked out in a contract, and people agree to certain contributions they'll provide in exchange for certain benefits. That's an exchange relationship. Sometimes you see that even with parents and their children. I'm going to give you this allowance, but you've got to do this work, or I'm going to provide money for you to go on this event, but you've got to come back and make it up by giving me the money back. And some parents keep close track, almost not just on finances, but on other things, work that kids do compared to how much work we put into the kids. So you can have exchange relationships in romantic partnerships, but also in other kinds of intimate relationships like parent-child. But usually in a family context, we don't stay in an exchange relationship. I haven't kept track of how much money each of my children owes me for all the expenses they incurred while they were under my roof. Some people might, I don't. I don't give my wife, an allowance of money that she's to use, and she better not go over that, or I'm going to pull money out of her account or something. I don't keep that exchange relationship, even if I started out that way, maybe, or even if at times I can move into that I-it form of relation. Most of the time, people who are intimate for long periods of time operate mostly in what we call communal, you don't keep score kind of relationship. And that isn't I thou all the time or necessarily, but it does mean that we're not in the business of keeping tabs on each other on how much we're giving and how much we're taking from our relationships. You notice the difference there, right? I mean, when someone's in that exchange mode and you want to be in a communal mode or have operated in a communal mode, it can feel quite offensive. Like if my dad were to call me up right now and say, Jeff, I haven't brought this up, but I've kept track of how much all of the things you cost us, how much that was when you were a kid living in our home all these years ago, and it's time to collect. I need to get you to pay me back. That would surprise me, and I also wouldn't have the money for him, I'm sure. But that would really, damage the relationship, I think, for us to have operated in what I believed was a communal relationship and have it be flip-flopped into an exchange relationship. So you see how I, thou, and I-it can be connected to some of these topics throughout the book. And I think they really do infiltrate every topic in the chapter. But I want you to be able to identify at least a couple theories in the book that fit with I-it ways of relating, maybe hint at or are open to the possibility of I-thou as well. I think you can find some I-thou in the book, though not as much as the I-it, at least hinted at, if not described. So work on that if you would. If you have questions about Martin Buber's philosophy, let me know. Send me an email as you like, and I'll try to get back to you. But I think it's a fascinating approach to love, and I think it fits my experience. You see if it fits yours. Okay, everybody, thanks so much for joining me today, and have a good rest of your day.